War. War never changes.
Shut up. Yes, it does. And it does so constantly. In fact, it's one of the most volatile and sensitive parts of human nature, with the way we fight wars changing over the course of anywhere from hundreds of years to less than a day. Sometimes the means by which we wage war changing multiple times during just one conflict. War is always evolving, and has been for millennia, ever since a caveman hit another caveman with a stick, and the second caveman presumably came back and stabbed the first caveman with a sharper stick. I mean, just think about it. The phrase bringing a knife to a gunfight is a huge indication of how our conflicts have evolved. Those once mighty sharpened sticks giving way to the firearm in the Middle Ages and becoming almost entirely irrelevant in the time since. Hundreds of years later, one of the most notable and legendary pieces of evidence of war's constant state of flux would emerge a few years before the largest conflict in human history as the M1 Garand. Widely regarded as one of the greatest infantry rifles ever produced, it bears the now all too commonly repeated moniker of the greatest battle implement ever devised. But where did the name come from? And how accurate is it? The story of the M1 Garand begins with the American entry into the First World War. Woodrow Wilson, the president at the time, wanting to exact revenge on the German Empire for sinking some boats with Americans on them and attempting to enlist Mexico to attack them, asked Congress to declare war in April 1917, but there was just one problem. The United States was not very well prepared to go to war. You see, the policy of the United States since its inception had been neutrality in European affairs, something George Washington himself emphasized in his final presidential address, and this policy of keeping out of Europe's wars was still incredibly prevalent in American politics at this time. And this kind of notion is again starting to rear its head in the US after over half a century of questionable American involvement across the globe. I'm looking at you, Grenada invasion, and Panama invasion, and the Vietnam War, and the Iraq War, and the Afghan... Okay, I'm getting sidetracked, but back to 1917. At their time of entry, the US had about 600,000 of their standard issue Springfield M1903 rifle and desperately needed more, and here is where the issues would arise. While remaining quote-unquote neutral on paper since the war had begun, the US had been manufacturing and shipping weapons to the Allied powers for pretty much the entire war, specifically one Patton 14 Enfield rifle, a variant of Britain's venerable Lee Enfield rifle, and almost every major American firearm manufacturer was tooled solely to create the weapon. So the American government, for once acting rationally, probably because the answer was literally staring them in the face, realizing it would be faster to just use the Enfield, began producing a 30-06 chambered version of the weapon, because the supreme American infantryman couldn't be caught using the filthy inferior .303 British cartridge on the battlefield. That's heresy! 2 million would be produced by the war's end, but it taught the Americans an important lesson. Always be prepared for war, and they wouldn't waste any time arming themselves for the next inevitable conflict. The larger lessons of the supposed war to end all wars, a moniker so tragically wrong that over 100 years later it's morbidly hilarious, pushed the US to invest in what at the time were called auto-loading rifles, or rifles that didn't require the operator to manually chamber new rounds. In the midst of this drive to develop a new breed of rifles, John Garand enters the conversation, a man whose contributions to the advancement of the American military have led many to forget that he was actually Canadian, and less forgivably, French-Canadian. Ugh. My traditionally English reaction to anything French aside, Garand arrived in the US at the turn of the 20th century, beginning work at the tender age of 12, and slowly learning about industrial manufacturing and teaching himself how to develop new products, having 2 patented inventions by the time he turned 18, just as the founding fathers intended. During the war, he had begun work on a semi-automatic rifle, eventually catching the attention of the US government and being hired by the Springfield Armory post-war in 1919 to develop his designs further, though his initial prototypes would be abandoned in the early 1920s. Through the rest of the decade, the US military would test a number of new semi-automatic rifles chambered in the .276 Pedersen cartridge, featuring designs from the likes of Colt, Browning, and Pedersen themselves, along with one from Garand at Springfield known as the T3. By 1932, it was evident to the US military that the .276 autoloader concept was going nowhere, and cancelled all of them except for Garand's T3E2, which they wanted, but rechambered in God's caliber, .30-06. Utilizing the skills he had acquired as a teenager, Garand built a weapon with an expanding gas operation similar to the steam engines he had become familiar with, as well as implementing a novel design for the magazine, a fixed internal one, loaded with an on-block clip. Garand was by no means the first to implement such a clip, and its use has become a point of contention surrounding the weapon's legacy, but there was a reason for its use. See, magazine-fed weapons were still a fairly new concept at the time, and the United States military, known for its conservatism, was still wary of them, considering externally protruding magazines to be easy to damage and to lose, along with their use creating additional orifices for dirt and moisture to enter the weapon, and the belief that such weapons would cause hindrances to prone position firing. So Garand opted for the on-block to circumvent such cautions. There has been significant debate over the most defining feature of the Garand's on-block clip, the ping made by the weapon when the spent clip is ejected, some claiming that this quirk was so distinctive that it resulted in American casualties, with Axis soldiers supposedly targeting those they knew were out of ammunition due to the ping, but there is little to no documentation of any such casualties happening. Also, the battlefield is an infamously loud place, and in the fog of war, determining whose weapon just ran out of ammunition would be a difficult task to say the least, if the sound was even discernible from the rest of the carnage unfolding to begin with. Regardless, Garand's resulting rifle would become known as the US Rifle 30 Cal M1, remaining in testing for another 4 years to iron out any remaining flaws, becoming adopted as standard issue for the United States in 1936, and with production beginning slowly in 1937. As war loomed in 1941, production began to ramp up, and the US military, upon entering the war, similar to 1917 after its boats were attacked, this time by the Japanese, was the only nation to enter World War II fielding a semi-automatic rifle as standard issue, a fact that would prove pivotal in the legacy of the Garand. (1884) London, England. Hiram Maxim, a British-American inventor, begins work on his self-titled machine gun, a recoil-operated, self-loading weapon that, unbeknownst to Maxim, would reshape modern conflict as the world knew it. Maxim's revolutionary weapon would be released in 1886, becoming readily adopted by the empires of Europe and serving as the principal weapon in Europe's great scramble to see who could speedrun colonizing the largest portion of Africa with the highest number of atrocities along the way, along with seeing heavy use during the brutal trench-locked combat of the First World War. You might be saying, why is he talking about a 19th century machine gun in a video about the M1 Garand? To which I retort, this is my video, I'll do what I want. In all seriousness though, the Maxim is significant here because of the developments it kicked off. Everyone and their mother was attempting to build self-loading weapons, and some were successful, mainly handgun designs, due to the low power of their ammunition, but cracking the self-loading rifle would be more of a challenge. Well, cracking wasn't much of a challenge, most attempts at a self-loading rifle broke after just a few shots, but building one that didn't self-destruct would require some more work. Some practical designs would emerge over the next few decades, with a few notably seeing limited use in the First World War, but they were never deemed ready for mass production. With the standard adoption of the Garand, the US became the first nation to field an auto-loading weapon, and a reliable one at that, as their standard issue rifle, giving a similar upper hand to the US as was given to Europe after they adopted the first machine gun. Back in the Pacific, the Garand would see its first combat in the American defense of the Philippines in December 1941, the Japanese marveling at how the US could afford to equip every infantryman with what they thought were machine guns, and the rifle would make its debut appearance in Europe at Dieppe in August of 1942. As the war progressed, so too did the efficiency with which the Garand could be produced, with the Americans building over 150 every single hour at peak production, equivalent to the number of unhinged posts the average current Twitter user makes per hour. Sorry, I mean X. By the end of the war, some 5.5 million rifles had been produced, one of several infantry weapons your average Yank could find themselves equipped with, and the logistical nightmare this created would be the basis for the Garand's replacement, which we'll get to shortly. By 1945, the Garand, in service for its 7th year, would receive its moniker, the greatest battle implement ever devised, though the larger quote has eluded the wider remembrance that the praise for the M1 has had, with General Patton, the originator of the iconic phrase, adding in the letter it comes from that their machine guns, mortars, artillery, and tanks were without equal, and that, combined with the might of veteran American infantrymen, could defeat any other fighting force on the planet. But the question that follows is, obviously, was he right? The answer should be just as obvious. Yes, he absolutely was, at least at the time. In the near century since the Garand entered production, its history and reputation have been touted constantly, but with little recognition as to why the weapon was so pivotal during the war. The impact of the M1 Garand cannot be understated. Whilst wars like the American Civil War and the First World War can be accredited as being the first truly modern wars for various reasons, the Garand alone changed the face of war forever. The M1 was the first standard-issue semi-automatic service rifle fighting primarily against bolt-action rifles, meaning that the American infantryman had significant fire superiority compared to his foes. With the Garand's introduction, individual marksmanship, the core of individual firearm warfare since their introduction, was negated heavily, and sheer volume of fire became the deciding factor in a battle. Where nearly every other soldier in the war would have to reacquire their target after every shot with a bolt action, an American armed with an M1 could fire 8 shots without ever having to take their eyes off their enemy. Its exceptional reliability furthered its battlefield impact, with a much lower chance of jams or stoppages providing another advantage for the Garand. Following the introduction of the M1, never again would bolt-action weapons be the standard issue of any so-called modern military force. It represented a transition in arms production and priorities, moving the military world away from such now antiquated rifles as standard issue, to equipping soldiers with semi or fully automatic weapons to increase overall rate of fire and thus maximize the chance of victory in modern combat. Even John Garand himself didn't shy away from praising his weapon, saying, "She's a pretty good gun, I think." The Garand's story doesn't end in 1945, the rifle remaining as standard issue throughout the Korean War, ultimately being replaced, along with most other American infantry small arms, in 1957 by the M14, a weapon I have some thoughts on, but to keep it brief, it was an uncontrollable rifle and automatic fire that couldn't replace any of the weapons it was designed to supersede, overall being a cheap facsimile of the weapon that had given America a clear advantage over its enemies in the 1940s. Nonetheless, the Garand remained in service until the mid-1960s, seeing some use in Vietnam with the first American advisors sent to the country, along with being one of the US's most commonly exported military weapons from the 40s until the 70s, during the CIA's prime of cooing third world countries that weren't protecting American interests. Sorry, freeing third world countries from the threat of communism. The weapon would receive a few variants during its life, namely its two sniper variants, the M1C and the M1D, along with shortened quote-unquote tanker variants such as the M1E5, and it also has some interesting foreign knockoffs such as the Japanese Type 4 rifle, the Italian Beretta BM59, and the homegrown Ruger Mini 14. As for Garand himself, he wouldn't see a penny from any of the over 6 million M1s that were produced, something a lot of articles seem to paint him as a quote-unquote true patriot for doing, when surely him making a ridiculous amount of money off of his invention would be the true American way. But I digress. Congress would attempt to pass a bill compensating Garand $100,000 for his royalty-free gun that had essentially won them the war, but it would never get signed, though he would receive a Medal for Meritorious Service from the military and a Medal of Merit from the government, passing away in 1974, remembered fondly, and with the pronunciation of his name still being a mystery to everyone. If someone tells you they know it, they're lying to you. It's like someone telling you they know where all of their taxes go. You might think you know, but you never can tell. It may have had a relatively short time in service, but the impact of the M1 Garand is undeniable. It reshaped the way the militaries of the world viewed infantry warfare, and rewrote the rules of war so much that its introduction practically nullified the effectiveness of every other rifle that had come before it. While certainly antiquated today, the Garand was a technical marvel of its time, and a stepping stone towards the modern infantry weapons and tactics we're all familiar with today. General Patton was certainly correct. The M1 Garand truly was the greatest battle implement ever devised. If you've made it this far, thank you for watching. I really appreciate it, and I hope you enjoyed the video, and maybe learned something new. If you did, please like the video and subscribe for more content, and I'll see you in the next one.